Today is the 58th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And it's kind of a slow news day, so I want to do an absolute deep dive, like one for the ages, one that will live on YouTube forever or whatever, on an archive over on our podcast that people can look back on, with my buddy Lamar Waldron. I'll get to that in just a moment. Recently we saw the exoneration of two people who had been accused of assassinating Malcolm X. This, I think, should cause us to pause for a moment and say, wait a minute, a rush to judgment in Malcolm X. There's still questions around the Bobby Kennedy assassination. There's still questions about the Martin Luther King assassination. And of course, the JFK assassination is the big one, right? Lamar and I researched this for decades. Lamar has spent more than 30 years working on this. He has written 3 books altogether. I participated in 2 of them. One of those books, the most recent, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, Lamar wrote himself. The ones that he and I wrote together, Ultimate Sacrifice and A Legacy of Secrecy, are still out there and in print. We're going to be talking about 2 secret sources that gave us information about the JFK assassination. And we're going to do it, as I said, a deep dive all 3 hours of the program today. In our 3rd hour, we will take your calls for Lamar and me on what we learned out of this. But first, I want to lay it all out. So with us now is my co-author on those first 2 books, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. Or I guess I'm his co-author. Lamar did the majority of the heavy lifting on these books. I participated in a lot of the research. Variety called him the ultimate JFK historian. The Chicago Tribune called him one of the best investigative journalists in America. Lamar, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you again, Tom.
And thank you, Lamar. So let's start like you did in your most recent book, the JFK, the Hidden History of the JFK assassination. Who killed John F. Kennedy and why?
Well, to give you the briefest summary possible, which even that'll take 4 or 5 minutes, the masterminds who killed JFK were 3 mafia bosses. Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of Louisiana and much of Texas. Santo Trafficante, the godfather of Tampa, and again, the mob boss of much of Florida, though Miami was kind of an open city, but Trafficante was certainly first among equals, even in Miami. And then a guy who was not a godfather. Those first 2 were godfathers. And if you know anything about the mafia, the godfather sits at the top of a mafia family. But the next guy involved, who was totally crucial, and one of the secret sources we're going to be revealing today, actually told me, that you got 2 if you've got Marcello and Trafficante, but you need the 3rd. And he was totally right. And he was Bobby Kennedy's right-hand man. We'll talk about him shortly. But that mafia don's name was Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli was the Chicago Mafia's man in Hollywood and Las Vegas. Johnny Roselli worked for the mob boss of Chicago, a man by the name of Sam Giancana. But Sam Giancana was under so much pressure by the Kennedy Justice Department in '63, he couldn't really take an active role. But Johnny Roselli sure could. And so those 3 mob bosses, but they were something else. They were, in addition to being mob bosses, they were also CIA assets. All 3 of them had been working with the CIA since even before JFK became president on originally Vice President Richard Nixon's plots to have the CIA and the mafia work together to assassinate Fidel Castro. That all started before the 1960 election.
This was back in '59, wasn't it? Nixon setting this up in anticipation of the election because Kennedy was beating him up so badly for letting Castro go, take Cuba communist?
Well, actually, even before JFK got the nomination in the summer of '60, you're exactly right. It started in '59 when Nixon went to Jimmy Hoffa and had Hoffa be kind of the broker between the CIA and the mafia, but that didn't work. So in the summer of '60, they said, let's go more direct. So the CIA directly sat down and talked with Johnny Roselli. He got him in touch with his boss Giancana, and most importantly, Santo Trafficante, and then Carlos Marcello came into the mix. So it's important to remember, because some critics who either haven't read our books or haven't read anything we published since 2005 try to say, well, Waldron and Hartmann blame it completely on the mafia, which is totally wrong. If anybody reads our books or has seen the Discovery Channel specials produced by the NBC News Dateline division, they'll know we always bring the CIA into it. And so those mob bosses were able to get other people in the CIA to work with them, including the head of operations at the Miami CIA station, a man by the name of David Morales, a lower-level agent by the name of Bernard Barker, a name familiar to some of your listeners because he was the assistant to a guy your listeners, many of them will know, by the name of E. Howard Hunt. And then there were other mobsters involved as well, like David Ferry, played by Joe Pesci in the Oliver Stone film, who was actually a CIA agent, and a guy named John Martino. And so those men working together, along with the head of the French Connection, the developer of the French Connection, that brought in the heroin. There was a big heroin problem throughout the 50s and into the early 60s, and then again starting in the late 60s. The head of that operation, whose apartment you visited while he was still alive, the outside of it, a guy by the name of Michael Victor Mertz, who was deported by the United States government.
Oh, I tried to track him down to France.
Exactly right.
I flew to France and spent a whole week chasing that guy.
And you actually had the guts to go to his apartment, which is on one of the nicest streets in Paris.
Oh, yeah.
The same street where the Duke of Windsor lived, and so those guys working together. And like I say, Mertz got deported by customs, INS. Actually, the day after the assassination from Dallas. Right. So those guys working together, but they were all also working for the CIA. So again, the top guys in CIA, they weren't involved because they didn't even know about these CIA mafia plots that were continuing into 1963. But yes, these lower level guys we just mentioned, and get this, all the mob bosses confessed. You don't have to take our word for it, and they didn't confess for money. They confessed late in life to very trusted associates. And John Martino confessed. David Morales confessed. Bernard Barker almost confessed. And so those. And by the way, Bernard Barker was a Cuban exile. So many people say, well, was it the CIA? Was it the mafia? Was it Cuban exiles? Well, Barker is a perfect example of somebody who was all three. But because they had those CIA connections, they were able to do what we'll be talking about much of the first hour, which is this super, super top secret plan that's really part of the reason everything has been kept secret for so long. And your listeners should know, we got the story in most cases, in addition to 30, I don't want to diminish 30 years of work on our part, or things where we spent that day looking through all the microfilm of the Tampa newspapers that we discovered. Insane. JFK was almost killed in Tampa 4 days before Dallas. Many of your listeners don't realize that. And
they also tried to kill him in Chicago before Tampa.
Exactly. 3 weeks before Dallas, I almost killed him in Chicago. 4 days before Dallas, I almost killed him in Tampa. Our books are the only place you'll ever read about that because we discovered it. And then I talked to the Tampa chief of police at the time. He says, boy, I've been waiting. I talked to him in the mid-'90s. He's like, yeah, I've been waiting on this call for decades. I'm shocked nobody's called me about this because it was no secret. And so, but we got the inside story from 24 people who actually worked with John and Robert Kennedy on these very things.
So, Lamar, why was so much of this kept secret? It seems, I guess, self-evident that all of these kind of low-level CIA guys were involved in the assassination of Kennedy. It wasn't known to people high up in the CIA, but it would still be profoundly embarrassing. Is that an accurate assumption? Lamar?
Point out, David Morales, while he wasn't a top CIA official based in Washington, there was too much discrimination. He had Native American background. he was definitely what you'd call a mid-level CIA official. Miami at that time was the largest CIA station in the world. Some of your listeners will know that the CIA is not supposed to conduct operations inside the United States. You're supposed to, conduct operations in Russia or Germany or Cuba or something. No, the largest CIA station in the world in 1963 was on the campus, some secret buildings on the campus of the University of Miami, and he was the head of operations for the largest CIA station in the world. So he was definitely in the mid-level, but yeah. So there were so many ways the CIA had been compromised. In a nutshell, thinking that money and supplies and personnel they were providing to the mafia, they thought, to help kill Fidel Castro, once some of those got diverted to the JFK assassination plot, you can sort of see the position they were in then and they're in now. But to get into the biggest secret of all, a secret that you and I were complicit in keeping for many, many years, it'd probably be good to go into to at least the first four of the John and Robert Kennedy associates that we actually interviewed.
Yeah, and I'd like to do that when our commercial stations rejoin us in about 2 minutes. But because I think that's a really big deal.
Oh, well, let me add this, since we've got a little under a couple of minutes. So again, the important thing to remember here is that there's a big secret we're about to go into shortly, but the CIA just had so much to cover up then, and as we'll go into more detail later, but it doesn't hurt to say it now. So the CIA is keeping information from the Warren Commission, from the Rockefeller Commission, from the Church Committee, the Senate Church Committee in the mid-'70s, from the House Select Committee on Assassination in the late 1970s, and from the presidentially appointed, congressionally created JFK Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. So most people think there was only one official government committee, the Warren Commission. The mainstream media would like you to think that, right? Mm-hmm. But in fact, there were at least five, in many ways more, but there were at least five official, very public government committees. And so, once decisions were made to keep stuff from the Warren Commission, they then kept keeping it secret from these others. And then they've just kept keeping it secret today, because it would be so incredibly embarrassing for them to admit that these CIA assets that they were using without presidential authority, that's important, to try to kill Fidel Castro, because they were continuing those 1960 plots right up until and after JFK was killed. That would be, those plots are somewhat known today, but the degree to which those plots were used to kill JFK is not known.
And so, Lamar, let's start, where you and I kind of began back in the 90s when we were first, or in the 80s, actually, when we were first doing a real deep dive into this. And that would be with John F. Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk.
That's exactly right. And you raised another point. People should know what got us into this, because it's going to come up again when we reveal another secret source. Was a 1988, fall 1988, special by the most prominent journalist of the 1970s, and was still pretty well known in the 80s, a guy by the name of Jack Anderson. And he did a special on the 25th anniversary. You and I both saw it. Jack Anderson had known Johnny Roselli, had interviewed him and used some of his information. And at the end of that special, it said, and I'm paraphrasing here because I haven't seen it in quite a while, that there were still hundreds of pages of JFK assassination files still secret. So you and I saw the end of that and was like, well, what on earth could be key? Because that's the 25th anniversary, fall of '88. What could be so secret that there were still hundreds of pages of files secret? Of course, we were so naive because they released 4.5 million pages since, but that doesn't even include all the really good stuff. So that's what got us into it. And then we were working at a corporate communications company that you owned. Yeah, and ad agent, yeah. And doing the newsletter for Georgia Public Television, the PBS outlets in Georgia. And Dean Rusk who had been JFK's Secretary of State and the Secretary of State for JFK's successor, Lyndon Johnson, through much of the 60s, too. And so he was a distinguished guy, and they were going to be doing a program of his oral reminiscences, and I read his biography in preparation for that. And so the plan was we'd interview him for the newsletter. I would interview him for the newsletter. You and I would talk about everything ahead of time. And then at the end of the conversation, I was going to ask him a question or two about, what could be so secret that it would still be secret after 25 years. Plus, I'd come across a Washington Post article that had mentioned in the obituary of a Cuban exile that this particular Cuban exile had been part of JFK's plans for a second invasion of Cuba in the fall of 1963. Well, for your listeners that don't have the gray hair you and I have, once Castro came to power, first Richard Nixon tried to assassinate Fidel. That didn't work. The CIA sold JFK a bill of goods saying, well, we'll train these Cuban exiles to go in, and they'll, 1,500 or so Cuban exiles, they can conquer all of Cuba. Castro's 100,000-man militia and army, these guys can take care of that. And of course, the CIA didn't believe that for a moment, but the CIA was still working with the mafia without telling the new president. They were still working with Trafficante, Roselli, and Marcelo.
At the same time, Bobby was aggressively prosecuting these mafia guys.
Right, because that's how JFK became president in the first place, was going after, on televised hearings, widely publicized hearings, going after the mafia, including Trafficante, dragging Sam Giancana, Roselli's boss, and Carlos Marcello in front of the Senate committee. So Senator John F. Kennedy and his brother, the committee's counsel, Robert Kennedy, that's how JFK came to prominence, was going after the mafia and their ally/banker, Jimmy Hoffa. And so once JFK became president, he appointed his brother Bobby Attorney General. People can debate the merits of that, but it was no Trump-like situation. I mean, Bobby, everybody, because you and I've talked to, a bunch of people that work with Bobby, and Bobby went after the mafia harder than anyone, because the mafia had it easy under Nixon. He'd been in the mob's pocket since he began.
Well, and J. Edgar Hoover, too, was being blackmailed by them.
Exactly. So, so finally they were going after the mafia. So unknown to Bobby, Attorney General Robert Kennedy and President Kennedy, while the Bay of Pigs is going on, the mafia is still working for the CIA because, there's no way 1,500 Cuban exiles are going to conquer Cuba or defeat Castro's 100,000-man army militia. But, the hope would be that even though JFK swore U.S. troops would never be used in Cuba, the CIA was certain that once Fidel and probably Raul and Che Guevara were all killed by the mafia, that then JFK would have no choice. There would be chaos in Cuba. A lot of Americans still lived in Cuba, had interest and property that had not quite yet been all nationalized. And so that was what was supposed to happen. Well, that didn't happen. That was a big failure. And then a year and a half after that, something in 1962 called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very important. And because that's when we all thought, and I don't know about you, but I know for me, we would go to the bomb shelter in elementary school, and
we were terrified. I was terrified. I was a little kid. I was terrified. We thought the world was going to end. We thought it was going to be a nuclear holocaust.
Exactly right. So that was just a year before JFK's assassination. So that's going to bring us up to what I'm going to reveal that Secretary of State Dean Rusk told me and us about this big secret. It's the reason, one big reason for so much secrecy even today.
John F. Kennedy, Lamar Waldron, and I wrote 2 books, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy, on this, and then the ultimate book, which Lamar wrote himself more recently, titled The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. We were just talking about how back in '88, Louise and I owned an advertising agency in Atlanta. It was called the Newsletter Factory. And we were producing a newsletter. We also produced a newsletter for the Kennedy Library, which is how I got in to meet Dave Powers. We'll talk about that later. But we were producing a newsletter for the local PBS station in Atlanta. And Dean Rusk was coming in to do an oral history. And Lamar went over to interview him on our behalf. Lamar was running the seminar division of our company, which By the way, we conducted seminars for the NSA. We taught the CIA. We taught Army intelligence. We taught everybody.
Do you remember when the FBI paid for their? It was like $300, and they paid with I think like their drug buy money.
Yeah, it was. Cash. Yeah, it was like these FBI guys showed up and they paid in cash. It was funny. Anyhow, so you went and interviewed Dean Rusk. And he dropped this bombshell that got us just nuts on, okay, we've got to figure out who killed Kennedy because of this.
And who can tell us more about what Rusk revealed. So, so the first half of the interview, Rusk had his answers. I mean, it was the same because we got to see an advanced showing of that special that was going to be on Georgia PBS, and the biography. I mean, he had his rehearsed answers about Vietnam and why it wasn't such a bad idea to start with, and then it turned into a bad, and it was it was just the routine stuff. And then at the end, with the tape recorder still rolling, I said, by the way, a friend of mine and I are working on a book. At that time, it was going to be a novel, and I just had a couple questions for you. And he said, sure. And I said, well, there was this one sentence in this otherwise big, uncontroversial Washington Post article, an obituary for a Bay of Pigs veteran, that said JFK was planning a second invasion of Cuba in the fall of '63. And I haven't read that in any history book or seen it in any documentary or anything ever. Is the Washington Post wrong? Are they right? What's the story? And he's like, oh, no, yes, we were going to do that. Yeah, we were. And I'm like, okay.
This is Kennedy's Secretary of State.
JFK Secretary of State is telling me something that's not in any history book, in any documentary, in any released document anywhere. Because by that time we'd been to this private archives in Washington. I'd been to the National Archives, and so it was just like, okay, so. And his demeanor changed completely. He's basically not the most exciting person. He's a pretty dry guy, and his special, the oral history, was dry. His incidents, most of them in his biography, were dry. But boy, he became animated because he said, I haven't talked about this in decades to anyone because it was so secret at the time. I'm like, okay. In fact, he said it was so secret, I didn't even know the full story on the plan until after JFK was assassinated. So we're talking about a plan so secret that JFK's own Secretary of State, and later on I found out even JFK's own Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, really didn't know the full scope of this plan until after JFK died.
Right, and let me add very quickly, we'll get to this later on in the program, but I went to Washington, D.C. and met with a general who was involved in this, who essentially threatened my life if I ever went public with this. That's how top secret that plan was.
Because we're going to be getting to that in just a few minutes. So bottom line is, he said, yeah, we were going to do that. It was a live program. This wasn't a maybe, an if. No, this was a go.
And this is after the Bay of Pigs.
So Bay of Pigs, April '61, Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. So now we're into November 1963. Literally when JFK died, this plan was imminent. And I asked him, I said, no, look, so we know, Congress, the Senate and the House, they found out in the 70s the CIA was working with this mid-level Cuban official that really didn't have much power, but he had a big travel budget, so he could go to Europe and places, so we could meet his CIA contacts, named Rolando Cubela. Is that what we're talking about? He says, oh, no. He was so he said Cubela was so far down the totem pole compared to the person we were dealing with, that the Kennedys were dealing with. And so, okay, so there are not that many high-level leaders in Cuba, Che and Raul and, of course, Fidel Castro were the only three I knew. And so he didn't give me the name of the person, but he said I said, there's those three. And then he said, yeah, so basically the guy the Kennedys were working with was, he implied he was higher than Che. So that would pretty much make him the third most powerful man in Cuba. So this was just stunning.
From John Kennedy's Secretary of State, confirming that there was another plot to assassinate Castro that involved one of the top three Cuban officials that Bobby and John were. And
this is important. Your listeners will hear this again. He said, we didn't look at it as an assassination plot. It was going to be a coup. This high level guy in Cuba was going to overthrow Fidel it was going to be secret that we were secret forever that we were secretly helping this guy, and so it would just look like Castro had been killed, and we later found out who he blamed on, and so. No one would ever know that the U.S. In other words, JFK wouldn't be taking credit for this in the '64 election. No, it would just be this thing happened in Cuba. There was this coup, and so this new guy's in charge, and we can deal with this new guy. And by the way, people don't have to take my word for that, because get this: the tape recorder kept rolling because I kept looking at it, and the little wheels were spinning. This was old, cassette tape recorder. But as soon as Russ started talking about the secret plan, when you listen to the tape, it fades out. So make of that what you will. But people have to take our word. You can if you Google Vanity Fair, Dean Rusk, and probably Thom Hartmann or Lamar Waldron. Vanity Fair confirmed this with Rusk, and he did it on the record and said, "Yep, that's what we were going to do." So after Rusk, then you and I were looking hard. So who else can we talk to? The obituary in the Washington Post that mentioned it. Well, that guy was dead, and the first FBI agent to ever go up against J. Edgar Hoover, a guy by the name of William Turner, who was
such a good guy,
such a great guy. I highly recommend his.
We had
book.
such, sorry, go ahead.
He's just a super guy. I mean, this is when presidents, attorney generals, and senators were all afraid of Hoover, and Bill Turner went up against him, and got drummed out of the FBI, of course, but that let him get into the JFK stuff. So he had written a book, and he had interviewed a Cuban exile, apparently close to Bobby Kennedy, by the name of Enrique Ruiz Williams, who went by the name Harry Williams.
Right.
And so
Bill's book, by the way, that was The Fish Red, wasn't it? What's the title of the book?
Fish is Red, and then it was reissued as Deadly Secrets, and I think it may even have a new name now. But like I say, William Turner, if he wrote it, you definitely want to read it. And so he even sent us his interview with Harry. He said, "Look, I don't want you guys starting from zero, because he'll just cover the stuff he's already told me. You want to get more than what he told me." So that was just great. So we didn't have to just cover what Harry had already told Bill. We said, okay, we know all this stuff. Now let's ask the next questions. And get this. So turns out Harry was a big hero of the Bay of Pigs. He wasn't a leader at the Bay of Pigs. He was a hero. I mean, he was a hero. He was badly wounded. He was in a field hospital with maybe 20 other of the most badly wounded prisoners after they were all captured by Fidel. Fidel Castro goes into the field hospital. Harry reaches into his boot when Castro's about 6 feet away from him, and even though Harry's badly injured, he pulls out a pistol, points it at Fidel Castro, and fires. Unfortunately, Harry's fellow prisoners had thought Harry was so badly injured he might commit suicide with that pistol. They had removed the bullets. Fidel, though, so Fidel's guards all jumped on this badly injured Harry. Fidel waved him off. He said, "Look, this guy's got guts. He's got courage. Let's take him and these other guys. Let's put him in a good Cuban hospital." So for trying to kill Fidel, Harry got in a good Cuban hospital, and a guy came to visit Harry Williams, a guy who was the head of the Cuban army, the number 3 guy in Cuba, the highest black official in Cuba, because, of course, Fidel and Raul weren't black, and Che wasn't even Cuban. So they had known each other back when Commander Juan Almeida who was then the head of the Cuban Army, and would stay the head of the Cuban Army for years, back when he would guard Harry's car, when Harry would go to that famous restaurant in Havana, I think it's called the Floridita, that Hemingway made famous. And when Almeida was a teenager, Harry would pay him to watch his car to make sure nothing happened to it, but they stayed friends. And so now Commander Almeida is the head of the Cuban Army, and he comes to see Harry. And we now know, Harry didn't even know this, Commander Almeida had made it clear 2 months before the Bay of Pigs that he was ready to defect and help the United States, but the CIA didn't act on that, even though their sources were telling them this, because the CIA was confident the Mafia was going to kill Fidel, so they didn't need the head of the Cuban Army. How stupid, right? But anyway, Commander Almeida told Harry, "Look, if you ever get the chance to convey information to John Kennedy, tell him that I think Fidel's going off the rails. It's not the socialist paradise. It's on its way to becoming a dictatorship. A bunch of people helped overthrow the Nixon-supported dictator Batista, but a lot of those guys had gone by the wayside. Either they had to fled or they'd been killed, and so that friendship was rekindled there. Harry and the other badly wounded prisoners were released and told to go to the United States. And basically they had until the end of 1962 to get the Kennedys to ransom the other Bay of Pigs prisoners, or Castro implied he might start shooting them. And so Harry came to the United States. He was regarded as a total hero by all the other Cuban exiles. And he was the one that went to Bobby Kennedy and said, "You've got to do this." And things dragged out, and Richard Nixon, responsible for the whole mess, torpedoed early plans to get the prisoners out. So this became a very dramatic thing, and Harry and Robert Kennedy got those prisoners out by Christmas of 1962.
Yeah, it was an amazing story. I remember Harry telling us, well, we'll get into that in a minute. We're talking with Lamar Waldron, and we'll be right back. It's a deep dive into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Stick around. Got us to Harry Williams, and right. Harry Williams was talking, when we met with Harry, although I want to, really do the deep dive on this on the other side of this break.
I can think of some good details that are good to go into before the break, actually.
Okay, great.
So one place that's very interesting. So Harry was such a hero. So first he's a hero at the Bay of Pigs. Then everybody who's a Cuban American knows that he's the guy that got the Kennedys to get those Bay of Pigs prisoners out. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Harry, this is something else we can talk about before the break. The other rule was that the injured prisoners who were released to try to get the ransom mm-hmm. were told they would have to come back by the end of the year. And if they didn't, then one prisoner would be shot for every man that didn't come back. So that was the sword of Damocles. So as it got closer, so Harry and Bobby became very friendly. Harry would go to Bobby's house, go to Bobby's apartment in New York City. Even when Harry would say something like, because Harry didn't know a lot about U.S. political stuff, Harry said, I don't think Jimmy Hoffa's a bad guy. And Harry said, you might remember, Harry said Bobby, who wasn't a short guy, stood up on a chair and just got livid and started lecturing Harry about all the mafia connections of Jimmy Hoffa, which Harry, had lived in Cuba. He didn't, see those hearings. So Harry understood. And there were times when they would be like at Bobby's apartment in New York City when they would take a cab, and Bobby Kennedy was the son of one of the richest men in America, Joseph Kennedy. Who's kind of like Bill Gates of his era or the Warren Buffett of his era. And Bobby would never have money for the cab fare. So Harry would always be paying the cab fare for the son of one of America's richest men. But they, it was all good. Once Bobby pressed John, and it was such like you said, an incredible story to get those prisoners out by Christmas, that it was just, they developed this close bond, and that bond remained not just through 1963, but into 64, and in fact, because we won't really be going into detail on Bobby's assassination, weeks before Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Harry hadn't seen Bobby for a while. They got together, and Harry told Bobby, as Harry told us, he said, they're going to kill you. And by then, Harry was meaning, Hoffa and the mafia people.
Right.
And so.
And Harry told us this.
Harry told us this. Harry told Bobby. Imagine Harry telling Bobby that. So there was a time when Bobby Kennedy was in San Francisco, standing in an open convertible, and there was what sounded like a gunshot, and Ethel Kennedy was with him. She hit the floorboard, and Bobby. People said it looked like his knees were going to buckle, but he managed to stay, standing up. But yeah, he knew. I mean, Harry had told him, that was going to happen. So Harry Williams was just such a key person to all this, and after the break we're gonna quickly get into just the meat of this incredibly secret stuff he told us, and that other people that worked with John and Robert Kennedy confirmed.
Yeah, we'll be right back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour here in the Thom Hartmann program. We'll have Lamar Waldron, author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, and two other books about the Kennedy assassination we worked on for the better part of 20 years. That were authored by both of us, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy, although Lamar did the majority of the work on these books. So, Lamar, Harry Williams, very close friend with Bobby Kennedy, spends time with him in New York, spends time with him in the Hamptons, is working with him to try to overthrow the Bay of Pigs hero, working, well, let me just toss it to you. Continue with
what happened was, so it became known in the Cuban exile community in Miami, which still had a lot of back and forth at that time with Cuba, of course, that Bobby Kennedy and Harry Williams were close. And so one day, Harry Williams gets a call from his old friend, the commander of the Cuban army, actually the guy who founded the Cuban army back when there were only like Castro and his 12 disciples, literally the guy who founded the Cuban army and was the commander of the Cuban army, actually Commander Juan Almeida, calls Harry on the phone in Miami. And Harry's a little cautious because he's like, well, isn't this phone bugged? And Almeida says, oh, no, I control, that's controlled by the Army, monitoring the conversations, between Cuba and Miami. So, no, you don't have to worry. This is probably the only safe line in all of Cuba to talk on. And he says, look, if you can get Bobby to get JFK on board, kind of like we had talked about back in the spring of 61, but now it's May of 63, I'll overthrow Fidel Castro for you. But I've got to know, I've got to have the support of the President of the United States. So I actually have Bobby Kennedy's phone logs from that time. And you can see Bobby gets a call from Harry Williams. Bobby Kennedy calls JFK. They no doubt talk about Almeida's offer. And then Bobby Kennedy calls Harry Williams back, no doubt saying that, yeah, JFK is on board. And by the way, it's within a week of that we now have files, thanks to the 5th Government Committee, the Assassination Records Review Board, that show that high levels of the American military and other national security groups start making plans for what to do if high-level Cuban military official were to make an outreach to the United States. And of course, so they start making these plans. It'll keep going all the way through November. But of course, most of the people working on those plans are just looking at it as like Dean Rusk, as a what-if exercise. In reality, only JFK, Robert Kennedy, and a few other high officials, including Secretary of the Army Cyrus Vance, the father of the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance Jr. So again, you see how secret it is. So
these were the only guys who knew that in the first week of December of 63, which was 2 weeks after Kennedy was assassinated.
Well, literally, we have the date from the CIA file and implying it from what Harry said, but it was literally 10 days after Dallas, December 1st, 1963. That was the day. One military file doing that contingency, that the what-if planning, literally calls that D-Day. So we know that. So they were going to take out Castro on that day, and the thing that stopped it was Kennedy being assassinated. Exactly. So a couple of more super important things about the coup plan, aside from the fact of how secret it was. As far as I can tell, only about a dozen American officials, including JFK and Bobby, of course, and Cyrus Vance, and Alexander Haig, of all people, knew that all this planning that started the week after Almeida called Harry Williams wasn't just a what-if scenario, but it was the real thing.
But they also had to figure out what to do to deny, to have deniability, and this is what led to the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. Well,
and as Harry Williams told us, there would be someone in Cuba to take the fall for it,
right.
And from those planning documents, we know that that would be a Russian or a Russian sympathizer. So the CIA would be responsible for getting a Russian or a Russian sympathizer in place in Cuba, and they would take the blame.
Right. Can you spell Lee Harvey Oswald? We're doing a special 3-hour deep dive into the Kennedy assassination with my old friend, colleague, co-author, Lamar Waldron, the books that we wrote together about this, Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy. Also, Lamar's most recent book, The Watergate, The Hidden History, and The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. Variety magazine called him the ultimate JFK historian. The Chicago Tribune called him one of the best investigative journalists in America. And we started with Dean Rusk, John Kennedy's Secretary of State, came down to Atlanta when Lamar and I were running an ad agency in Atlanta. We were doing a newsletter for the public broadcasting station. Dean Rusk, we interviewed him, and we asked him, you know, right straight up, was there another attempt to assassinate Kennedy that nobody knew, or to assassinate, excuse me, Castro, that nobody knew about, you know, after the Bay of Pigs and after the Cuban Missile Crisis? And Dean Rusk said, yes, there was, which led us to Harry Williams, who was involved in this, who was very, very tight with Bobby, Bobby's closest aide during 1963 and 64, traveled all over the country together. And this was, you know, one of the most amazing and difficult interviews I think that I've ever had, that we've ever had. You know, meeting, well, actually with Harry Williams, not so much that, but the John Nolan one, and then Harry led us to John Nolan. But just wrap up Harry Williams real quick here, Lamar, and then let's get into John Nolan.
So what happened with Harry was, so the CIA was still spending millions of dollars a month on all these Cuban exile leaders. Bobby Kennedy said, look, I can't deal with all these guys. I will deal with you, Harry, because you're my friend. I trust you. You pick out, you know, maybe 4 other leaders from across the political spectrum. We'll back them. You know, the CIA is giving money to lots of other people, but we'll give some real money to the people you pick, and then they will all have to agree to work with Commander Almeida in a coalition government after the coup. Because, again, the Kennedys didn't view this as assassination. They viewed it as, well, the word everybody used with us was elimination.
Right.
And the coup plan. It was helping, you know, it was helping Cubans overthrow Castro, and then it would be followed by democracy. The mafia would not be allowed. And
let me jump in here real quickly, Lamar, because just because, you know, it's a whole brand new hour, and I want to, the biggest point that we made last hour that I failed to mention was that Harry, you know, revealed to us, and you know, that the commander of the Cuban army, Juan Almeida, had reached out to Harry and said, I'm willing to help overthrow Castro and the Castro regime, but we're going to need American help, you know, particularly after that happens. Bobby took this to John. John signed off on it. Bobby signed off on it. Cyrus Vance knew about it. John Nolan, Bobby Kennedy's closest aide. I mean, it's so it's this
big secret program, but unfortunately, even though the Kennedys were determined they would keep the mafia out of the coup plan. Remember, they didn't know the CIA was still working with the mafia to try and assassinate Fidel. So they were determined to keep these mobsters that Bobby was prosecuting, makes sense, out of the coup plan, and the mafia would be forbidden from reopening their posh casinos in Cuba after the coup plan. So the mafia was totally shut out. The mafia had nothing to gain by letting this coup plan go ahead because it wouldn't do them any good. So, unfortunately, at least half a dozen members of the mafia, and by that I mean mafia associates as well as made members, found out about the coup plan. I mean, people ranging from Jack Ruby to the guy John Martino I had mentioned earlier, David Morales, the head of CIA operations in Miami. So a half dozen mobsters and mafia associates, which of course would include Marcello, the godfather of Louisiana and Texas, Trafficante, godfather of Tampa and much of Florida, and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago mafia's man in Hollywood and Las Vegas, who was the biggest CIA asset of the group. They found out about this. And so what happened was, as hard as Bobby and Harry tried to keep the mafia out, they were able to worm their way in and learn about this plan, and they knew this was so secret. A year after we almost got blown up at the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this would have, that if they could somehow mix their plans taint, I guess you would say, the Kennedy plans to stage the coup in Cuba. If they could mix that up with the mafia's plans to use their CIA help, not to kill Fidel, but to kill JFK, that would force a cover-up that wouldn't last weeks or months, that could last years and decades, and it has.
Yeah, and
so,
maybe we should pause here for just one moment and point out that at this point now, late 1963, as the mafia has found out about all this stuff, they have also decided that they're going to kill John Kennedy. Exactly,
and we'll get into more detail on that later. But yeah, they originally were going to kill Bobby Kennedy, because he was the Attorney General prosecuting them. But as Carl and Hoffa was determined to do that. We talked to some Justice Department people who had come across that plot, and but as Carlos Marcello explained to one of his friends, and I'm sure also explained to his close associate Jimmy Hoffa, if you kill if you kill Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, JFK will just send in the army after you.
Yeah, wasn't the phrase he used in that? We talked with his lawyer,
exactly what he said was, if you cut off the tail of a dog, meaning if you kill Bobby Kennedy, the head of the dog, meaning JFK, will turn around and bite you.
Exactly.
But if you cut off the head of the dog, then the tail quits wagging, because everybody knew that Bobby Kennedy and LBJ didn't like each other. So literally, the day JFK was going to Dallas, so Harry Williams had his 4 other groups. They were called Bobby Kennedy's Five Fingers, because after Almeida staged the coup and blamed Fidel and probably Raul's death on a Russian or Russian sympathizer, just like if you open up your hand with Cuba being in your palm and then you close it, and those 5 fingers all go into Cuba. Harry Williams, there was a military group that we're going to talk about very shortly, being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. So the first U.S. troops into Cuba after the coup, because would be not a bunch of crew-cut, all-white U.S. Marines. No, it would be Cuban Americans, the veterans from the Bay of Pigs who had been in training, who were now officers and enlisted men, and the officers were being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. So they would be the first U.S. troops in this multiracial group, and it was even commanded by a black man who you talked to. And so this was all set. Harry was meeting with top CIA officials in a safe house in Washington on November 22nd. He was getting ready to go in to Cuba. By Monday, he would be going from Guantanamo, the U.S. base, into Cuba. He would be with Commander Almeida. So they were just days away from, I guess you would call it, the fail-safe point, where Harry couldn't be called back, because we didn't have a good way to communicate with Almeida once Harry was inside Cuba, and Harry would wait there until the coup. So these Cuban exile groups were trained, the Cuban American troops were trained. Harry was there. He was, and it was a go. It was all set, and then they get the call that JFK has been shot.
Right, and I got to say, just for people who are listening, you and I sat in Colorado in a restaurant with Harry over a few drinks, and as he laid this whole story out for us, I mean, it was just absolutely breathtaking.
And by the way, the reason he was still alive to talk when so many of his associates were murdered in the 60s and the 70s was because this man, who was a hero to every Cuban American in Miami who could not buy a drink or pay for a restaurant meal in Miami, he chose to live in the snowy wilds of Colorado.
Well, Bill Cooper thought he was
that kept him alive.
Right. Bill Cooper thought he was hiding out. I mean, it turned out he was just, he was importing guns. but the other thing was that he thought that this plan had been declassified. He didn't realize that he was telling us something that was still top secret, which is why when I met with Oliva, he threatened my life over just mentioning this case.
Well, and the important thing there is that Oliva disappeared from the scene in Cuba in the late 1980s. So when I'm talking to Dean Rusk, when we're talking to Harry Williams, and we're about to get into General Oliva and John Nolan, they all assumed that when you disappear in Cuba and you're an official, you're dead, right?
Right.
So that's the other big reason they were willing to share all this with us.
Right. So and obviously if the asset in Cuba, the head of the army who is going to overthrow Castro, if he's dead, then the plan must be gone, right? And welcome back. So Lamar, you want to?
So Tom, I can think of a couple of incredible things about Harry that are important that we could talk about before the break.
Sure.
Does that sound good?
Go for it.
So remember, Harry Harry's basically telling everybody he's working with, these Cuban, these other 4 hand-selected Cuban exile leaders. This is in the summer and fall of '63, as we're building up to JFK's murder, and the December 1st deadline for the coup, that the mafia is banned from the coup plan. Mafia will not be allowed to reopen their posh casinos after the coup. So the mafia, they don't like that, right? And they figure, well, if we can get rid of Harry, maybe 2 of the people that Harry picked, unknown to Harry, were also mafia associates. A guy by the name of Manuel Artemi, who had been one of the leaders of the Bay of Pigs, super conservative guy. I mean, far to the right of Hitler, Harry told us, and Tony Verona, a former Cuban senator who had been one of the political leaders that was supposed to take over after the Bay of Pigs. Harry didn't realize they had kind of sold the plan out to the mafia. Literally, I have the document where the mafia paid Tony Verona $500,000.
Which one of those guys was the guy I was chasing around Miami?
That's another guy that we'll save for the next.
Okay, all right.
Because you actually interviewed him.
Yeah.
So, so basically, so the mafia had a Cuban exile they liked to work with named Rolando Masferrer, who had death squads in Cuba. Vicious guy. And so Harry's at Bobby Kennedy's apartment, the Kennedy apartment in New York City. There's a knock at the door, and it's Rolando Masferrer and a couple of his torpedoes hitmen. And Masferrer basically threatens Harry with death in Bobby Kennedy's New York City apartment unless Bobby lets this Cuban thug mafia associate into the plan. And Harry's like, no. You can't do that. You can't threaten me. Doesn't matter what you do. You're not getting into the plan. Okay, so the mafia, pays off the guy I mentioned before, Tony Verona, who, unknown to Harry, has been working with the mafia to get Masferrer in, the kind of the back door to the plan. But then, so Harry goes to Guatemala to meet one of the other Cuban exile leaders, Manuel Artemi. Harry goes out to dinner before he's actually going to meet up with Manuel Artemi, because Artemi has a huge U.S.-funded secret camp in Guatemala, which is where his troops are going to be, his men are going to be, and they're getting like millions and millions from the CIA under the authorization of the Kennedys, so that they'll be able to get into Cuba after the coup, and Artemi will be part of that coalition government. But so Harry's gets into Guatemala late. He goes out to dinner at a really nice fancy restaurant in Guatemala. The next morning he is going to meet with Manuel Artemi. Now Manuel Artemi is, like I say, he's to the right of Adolf Hitler. His best friend in America is a guy by the name of E. Howard Hunt, who's one of the 2 CIA agents that the CIA assigned to work with Harry and to do whatever Harry wanted. Because remember, the CIA isn't calling the shots on the coup plan. Harry Williams and Bobby Kennedy are. And so basically in that fancy restaurant, a couple of gunmen come in, pull out their guns to kill Harry. Harry pulls out his gun first, shoots and kills one of them, gets in a gun battle with the other, and runs out through the kitchen.
And so wrapping up this story about Harry Williams and getting into John Nolan here, Lamar.
Right. So again, the plan is put on hold when JFK is killed. And by the way, Bobby Kennedy, who's good friends with Harry, Bobby's also good friends with Haynes Johnson, who's a top journalist at the time. And so Haynes Johnson calls Bobby Kennedy. Bobby has left the Justice Department. Even before the assassination, he's at his nice estate, Hickory Hill. And Haynes Johnson gets through to Bobby Kennedy, and he mentions that Harry's in the room with him, and Bobby says, put Harry on the line. Harry comes on the line, and I should say, before Harry comes on the line, Bobby tells journalist Haynes Johnson, who has written a book, by the way, on the Bay of Pigs, with Harry Williams.
Now, this is right after John is shot.
Right. This within 2 hours. Within 2 hours,
right.
John being shot. Haynes Johnson, like I say, he's visiting Harry at a safe house in Washington where Harry was.
And we confirmed all this.
Right. And so well, Harry and Haynes confirmed it.
Yes, to us. Yes. And
so,
others.
Though Harry told a slightly, though Haynes told a slightly different story to another writer until I told him we had recorded our interviews with Harry, and then he went back and confirmed what he had told us. Yeah. And that's basically, Bobby Kennedy told Haynes Johnson, one of your guys did it. Right. Manuel Artemi, who was the mafia compromised, one of those five fingers for Bobby Kennedy, was one of those co-authors who had worked with Haynes Johnson. So Bobby's initial instinct was to finger a mob-connected Cuban exile who was part of the coup plan.
And this is
in any event. So,
if I could, real quick, this is part of the extraordinary. I don't know if it's pronounced pathos or pathos. You know, it's just the kind of awful sadness about this. Bobby, after his brother has been assassinated, 2 hours after his brother is assassinated, is basically saying to this reporter and to Harry, one of his very closest friends, the program that my brother and I put together to overthrow Castro, that was also going to help them in the election of '64, by the way, let's add, that this program that we put together to overthrow Castro is what got turned around and used to kill my brother. And
that's exactly right.
And that just crushed him. I mean, he walked around for months just crushed by the idea.
He was shattered. I mean, we talked to John Davis, the Kennedy, who was part of Jackie Kennedy's family and wrote the Marcello biography, and he was at the White House the Saturday after the assassination on Friday, and he said, yeah, Bobby was just a shattered wreck of a person.
Yeah.
So, but let's get to John Nolan.
Right.
So
yeah, we've got about 2 minutes.
So once JFK is assassinated, his body, for some reason, of course, there's no autopsy done in Dallas, and the Kennedy, the security officials, FBI, Secret Service, I mean, they practically forced JFK's body out of the hospital because the Dallas officials, they want to do the autopsy there, right? And the Secret Service, FBI, they get it on the plane, they get it to Bethesda, a naval hospital. So why is all that? So one of the people that Harry Williams said we should talk to was a guy by the name of John Nolan. Most of your listeners will not know John Nolan from A Hole in the Ground, but John Nolan worked at the Justice Department. He was an attorney there. He was Bobby Kennedy's chief aide during 1963 and early 64. He had all the security clearances. Every top secret document that got sent to Bobby Kennedy, who was running the Cuban operation for JFK, was seen by John Nolan. So John Nolan knew everything. He is one of those dozen U.S. officials who knew, the coup plan is no what-if possibility. It's a sure thing. And so Harry said, you guys should talk to John Nolan. So we called, and I arranged he said, okay, you can come to or we can go out to lunch, I don't really want to talk about this at the office. We can go out to lunch. Okay. So I'm going to fly up to Washington. The day before I fly up, Nolan says, now Nolan, by 1992, he is a senior partner at Washington's most powerful law firm. He remained close to Bobby Kennedy, working on his last campaign until Bobby was shot. He then remained close to the Kennedy family, giving Ted Kennedy advice after Chappaquiddick that if Ted Kennedy had followed, Ted Kennedy might have become president someday. So John Nolan is this, John Nolan's the kind of attorney who argues in front of the Supreme Court, not once or twice, but he represents big companies, but he worked in civil rights for Bobby Kennedy, made dangerous trips to the South in the summer of '63. So John Nolan, was a guy who knew all the secrets. And when we come back, I'll tell you the biggest secret that he revealed about JFK's autopsy that is just amazing.
Lamar Waldron, the author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, and the co-author with me, or actually I'm the co-author with him, of Legacy of Secrecy and Ultimate Sacrifice, 2 other books about the Kennedy assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, and the Martin Luther King assassination. Lamar, we've gone from Dean Rusk, Kennedy's Secretary of State, to Harry Williams, who was the hero of the Bay of Pigs and was helping organize this plan along with the head of the Cuban army, Juan Almeida, to overthrow Castro or assassinate Castro with a Cuban-aligned patsy, essentially, taking the credit for it on December 1st, 1963. And and now we are talking about John Nolan, right?
Right. And by the way, it wasn't a Cuban-aligned patsy; it was a Russian-aligned.
Or Russian. Thank you very much.
Russian or Russian sympathizer
in Cuba.
Would be right. Who would be in Cuba to, as in Harry's own words, take the fall.
Yeah.
So John Nolan, the top assistant. I mean, Bobby Kennedy had a secretary, Angie Novello, but John Nolan was his high level executive assistant. Number two, could speak for Robert Kennedy, saw every top secret piece of paper. So, it was in fact John Nolan who was helping to route those calls, deciding who could speak to Bobby Kennedy the afternoon of the assassination while Bobby was at his estate and who couldn't. So he was making sure the right people, like CIA Director John McCone, knew where Bobby Kennedy was, and blocking all the non-essential calls. So what happens is, JFK's body is taken from Dallas against the wishes of the Dallas authorities, flown to Washington on the same plane where Jackie Kennedy and new President Lyndon Johnson are, and then it is taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where there's an autopsy, which has been the subject of many books. I mean, books not just about the JFK assassination. Many books have been written just about the autopsy because there are so many inconsistencies and mysteries and things that don't add up. And the main autopsy doctor burning his notes with his first autopsy reports in his fireplace because he didn't even know about one of the main wounds into JFK's body when he finished the autopsy. So all those questions about the autopsy, as far as I'm concerned, now they've all been answered because when so John Nolan, it was really we were going to get together for lunch in Washington. He was going to leave his the biggest law firm in Washington, where he's a senior partner, meet me for lunch. We were going to talk, and the only reason he was talking to me, he made it clear, was because he was still friends with Harry Williams after all those years. They were still close. He trusted Harry, and if Harry said I was okay to talk to, he would give me an hour of his time. Okay. So then I get to Washington, I call him and say, so we need to make some lunch plans. He says, no, can't. I can't meet you for lunch. You just come to the office. Okay. So I say, okay, I'll come to the office. And then he's like, no, we can't do that. Somebody might see you here. And again, this is because we're going to be talking about a plan that's been kept secret since 1963. This is 1992. And then he's like, I just can't see you. I'm like, look, I flew all the way up here. Harry said you'd be a good guy to talk to. So he agrees to give me a phone interview. Okay. We start talking. Every time, and I'm not at the Mayflower where we usually stayed, but I'm at the I think the Grand Hyatt where we would do our communication seminars. And every time I would get, we talk about general stuff, and he was a Korean veteran. My dad was a Korean veteran. He was about the same age when he was working for Robert Kennedy that I was when I was talking to him on the phone. So I was looking for those things in common. But whenever I would get close to talking about the coup plan, the worst crackling would come on the phone, and we would get cut off. I mean, it didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It didn't happen 3 times. It didn't happen 4 times. It happened at least 6 times. Finally, the last time, because I'm worried, somebody doesn't want us to talk about this. So I go outside. Luckily, there's a bellhop. I whip out a $10 or $20 bill. Say, look, get me a phone out of one of these other rooms. Plug it in here, and just take my phone. Put it in the other room. So bellhop does that. Bellman, I should say. And sure enough, no more problems. There was just something funny about that phone. And so he confirms everything Harry had told us about the coup plan. He confirms that E. Howard Hunt and James McCord were the top 2 CIA agents assigned to help Harry, not to give Harry orders, but to help Harry, which, by the way, E. Howard Hunt, who was a big racist, super resented, and that Bernard Barker was E. Howard Hunt's assistant for the coup plan. And so he's confirming all this stuff. And then we start talking about the autopsy. And he says, well, Bobby had me meet him in Washington, and then Bobby was up in the 17th floor family suite at Bethesda Naval Hospital. I was down in and just outside the autopsy room on a phone, and I was relaying Bobby Kennedy's orders to the White House physician Admiral Berkeley, who was in the autopsy room the whole time, and then Admiral Berkeley was giving orders to the autopsy physicians, sometimes through the commanding officer of Bethesda Naval Hospital. So sometimes it would go, it would literally, Bobby's 17th floor with Jackie, he's on the phone with Nolan, Nolan's relaying what Bobby wants to Admiral Berkeley, the White House physician. Admiral Berkeley is then either relaying those orders directly, in some cases, to the autopsy physicians or to the commanding officer, who was then relaying Bobby's wishes to the autopsy physician, who pretty much said, Bobby Kennedy controlled the autopsy.
Right,
so it was
if I can just insert real quickly here, at that point in time, Bobby Kennedy believed he knew who had killed his brother.
Oh, right, and he was assuming,
and he thought he had some role in it.
Well, Bobby Kennedy thought that, somebody somehow connected with the coup plan had turned part of the coup plan against JFK.
Right. And this had to be covered up no matter what, because this was still a live plan. And
get this. Bobby Kennedy was part of the cover-up, as John Nolan confirmed in a document you got at the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts confirmed, and then I got 20 more pages. Since September of 1963, a secret subcommittee of the National Security Council, overseen by, on the orders of Bobby Kennedy, was making plans for what to do if an American official was assassinated, and it seemed in any way somehow related to Cuba. Because they were worried, what if Castro found out about the coup plan and tried to retaliate? So since mid-September, this secret subcommittee had representatives from the State Department, from the CIA, from the Department of the Army in the form of Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano. They were making these plans. So Nolan,
if I could interrupt just to clarify, this is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and their fear was that if Castro found out that Kennedy was going to try and assassinate him on December 1st, 1963, number one, he could thwart it, but number two, if it happened or if it got publicized, it could cause Russia to intervene again, and it could lead to World War III. It could lead to the extinction of the entire world, or a large chunk of it.
Exactly, because we had almost had World War III the year before, and they worried about things like, well, maybe maybe Cuba might blow up an airliner. But like I say, one of their biggest worries was that, what if an American official got assassinated before the coup plan, and there looked like there was some Cuban connection? So Nolan. So we've only got about 21, I believe it's 21 pages of what are probably close to 1,000 pages of official U.S. government plans for what to do with an American official assassinated. We've got 21 pages. The rest of those are supposed to be released December 15th. Of course, they won't be. But John Nolan saw every one of those pages. He saw every one of them. So he's telling me, he said, look, that's why JFK's body didn't have the autopsy done in Dallas. And he gave me this example. And by the way, you won't find Nolan's name in any of our books. He is referred to as a Kennedy aide. So he's not named, because this is one of the first detailed times we're ever talking about this. So his name is not in print.
He just passed away.
Well, he passed away. Actually, he passed away almost 2 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But then then we had COVID. I didn't want to rush right out and do it. And I've mentioned him on your show exactly one other time with no real detail. So what Nolan gave me this incredible example. He said, "Look, what if a week before the coup plan, it looked like the U.S. ambassador to Panama, had been shot on a street in Panama City, in Panama." Was that Castro trying to send us a message? What would we need to do? Well, you sure wouldn't want the U.S. ambassador's autopsy done in a Panamanian hospital. You would want to take it to a secure military facility. You would want to, you'd have where the autopsy would be done not by private doctors, but by military doctors subject to military command.
Once again, Lamar, the reason why they were doing this was they were afraid that if the American public found out that a U.S. official had been assassinated by Castro, that would create so much pressure on the Kennedy administration to attack Cuba in retaliation, much like we attacked Afghanistan after 9/11. That attack on Cuba would be inevitable, and that would provoke World War III, and that had to be stopped at all measures.
Exactly right, Tom. That's exactly right. So. Because Nolan said, look, what if we attack Cuba? Then it turns out it was just a common mugging, or the ambassador had been shot by a jealous lover. So he said, we have to control the autopsy. We have to control all of the medical evidence. We have to control the release of any information about that autopsy. And there were other things, too. I mean, just in general, anything about that murder had to be filtered and carefully weighed in terms of national security. So I'll tell you, again, one more thing about Nolan, then we're going to move into somebody else's secret that we've never named before. And all of this stuff, I should have mentioned this. So this is good for just some of your listeners, okay? And so when I flew up to Washington, still expecting to, probably meet John Nolan for lunch, and if not that, go to his office at his huge law firm, the most powerful law firm in Washington, which means one of the most powerful law firms in all of America. I had a piece of luggage. I'd been getting ready to buy some really nice luggage, and you told me not to. Do you remember why you told me not to buy nice luggage?
I don't.
So you were traveling all over the world helping with the children's homes that you worked with, Salem. And you said, look, most airports are fine, but some aren't. And the fancier and more expensive looking your luggage is, because I was going to get, some designer luggage at Marshall's, like on a huge markdown that they had. And he said, if somebody's looking, because in those days, they didn't even match the tags. You were at baggage claim, you could pick up a bag and literally walk out. This is before 9/11, right? Mm-hmm. And you told me, you said, look, the fancier your bag looks, the more likely it is to get stolen.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, that's good. So I had the most old, beat-up, big suitcase you can imagine. I had lots of books and documents and notes in it. In fact, it was so old and beat up that the two clasps that held it, one was like a combination clasp that still worked. The other one, there was no way to open that clasp with the combination at all. But if you hit that clasp at a certain spot, it would spring open. So first, there's like a big delay in the flight getting off, then get to Washington, still in plenty of time for Nolan, and we all get to wait on our bags on that flight. We wait an hour almost for our bags. Now, you traveled more than I. An hour is a long time to wait for your bags, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then the bags start coming down the conveyor belt. They have all been opened and closed and searched. I mean, there's like underwear and lingerie and nightgowns hanging out of the bags. Some are half closed, some are, fully closed, but you can just see, there's clothes hanging out the sides. Somebody had literally searched every bag on that flight, including mine, except for the fact they couldn't open that bad clasp, okay? So my bag was literally the bag they really wanted to search was the only bag that couldn't get searched.
Well, you're assuming.
Well, get this next story that is just for the people listening right now. So I go and check into the Grand Hyatt. I go to the private archive, the Assassination Archives and Research Center, which I highly recommend, which is an online thing now. But in those days, it was in this old building near Ford Theater, had the old wire cage elevator. I go there. And I decide I'm going to save money, get some exercise. I'm going to it's not that cold. I'm gonna walk back to the hotel. Do a little sightseeing on the way. I don't know Washington. The Assassination Archives and Research Center is not in the safest part of Washington, but it's not a bad part. I take wrong turns and I get lost, and I'm wandering around in increasingly rundown, crime-ridden parts of Washington. I don't know where to go. Someone starts following me. I get really worried I'm going to get mugged. I turn into an alley. At the opening of the alley is a well-dressed man in a trench coat and a business suit, middle-aged. He says, the Grand Hyatt, go 2 blocks this way, and then take a right and go another block.
Amazing. So, Lamar, pick up the story.
So 2 more crucial things about Nolan. So one of the big controversies about the autopsy is that in Dallas, the Dallas doctors, when a bullet wound is made in the body, generally you have a small entrance wound, then the bullet expands inside the body, and you have a large exit wound. So in Dallas, the doctors saw what at least one of them said was a small entrance wound, it basically just below his Adam's apple in the hollow of his throat. Okay, and JFK was having trouble breathing because half of his brain had been blown out. So they did a small 2 to 3 centimeter tracheotomy incision over that small bullet hole. So you could still tell it was a bullet hole, but there was a small tracheotomy incision to try, desperate attempt to try to aid JFK's breathing. When the body, when the official autopsy started at Bethesda, and there's a photograph of JFK's body, that 2 to 3 centimeter little neat tracheotomy incision over the small bullet hole had been at least doubled in size, almost tripled in size, and now instead of being a neat little incision that a doctor had carefully done, it's this huge jagged wound, almost as if, as many people have pointed out, someone had gone into that wound and enlarged it looking for the bullet that made that wound. Okay? So, but the Dallas autopsy doctors, that wound was so big, the Bethesda autopsy doctors, because there were no Dallas autopsy doctors, the 3 main Bethesda autopsy doctors, they didn't even know there was a bullet wound there. There was just this big gaping wound they assumed was a crude, quickly done tracheotomy thing that was 2 or 3 times the size it was in Dallas. And so what was that all about? When was that made? Because they didn't make it at the autopsy. It was that way when the official autopsy started. So I asked John Nolan, I said, look, some investigators and writers have theorized that there was a very brief and rushed national security autopsy before the main autopsy, the official autopsy, which at that time Oswald was still alive. So, the official autopsy would probably wind up being used at Oswald's trial. So that's an official legal thing. But so I just asked John Nolan, was there like a little brief unofficial national security autopsy before the main autopsy the doctors got there and before the official autopsy began? And John Nolan, being one of America's top lawyers, said, he didn't say, well, what's a national security autopsy? He didn't say, no, there was no national security autopsy. He said, well, there were just so many national security considerations that's why things had to be done a certain way. And he said it was part of all those plans we had been making, in case an American official was assassinated. So I think, to me, he didn't deny it, and he talked about the national. So there was a brief national security autopsy, and get this. In that brief national security autopsy, we know from other witnesses who saw it, including a guy who later became an admiral and a guy who later became the head of the Bethesda Hospital, there was a bullet, when they were taking JFK out of the coffin, there was a bullet that rolled out of JFK's back that made that back wound 6 inches below the top of his collar. So
if Oswald was the lone shooter, there would not be an entrance wound in the front of Kennedy's throat. It would be an exit wound. He was
at the school book depository, either on the second floor or the 6th floor. Yeah, behind him. So, and of course, Dave Powers, one of JFK's closest aides, who was in the limo right behind JFK, said, and his buddy had confirmed to Tip O'Neill, Kenneth O'Donnell, that the first shot and the horrible fatal headshot, they both came from the grassy knoll.
Right. Dave Powers told me that.
He told
you in his office.
You were sitting in one of JFK's rocking chairs.
That's correct.
Because Dave Powers was the head of the JFK Presidential Library, and somebody who was working on their newsletter had been to our seminar, and we use that connection, and so you're sitting there with so John Nolan was Robert Kennedy's closest aide, Dave Powers was JFK's closest aide, and in the car right behind JFK with Kenny O'Donnell, and he told you, first shot and that horrible fatal headshot, they came from the front,
and later confirmed it. So So this is. So
that's why there was that national security autopsy. That's why so much medical evidence has disappeared. Well, we'll talk about that after the break, and then we'll get into the source that you interviewed.
Right. Got to make sure. But the bottom line here, got to make sure it was some lone shooter. With Lamar Waldron, the guy that the Chicago Tribune called one of the best investigative journalists in the United States. He's the author of numerous books. He and I together wrote Ultimate Sacrifice and Legacy of Secrecy about the Kennedy assassination. Legacy of Secrecy also goes into the Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations. And his most recent book on this, which he did himself, which is like the most updated version of all this, is titled Watergate, The Hidden History. Excuse me, the Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. He also wrote Watergate, The Hidden History, which is a brilliant book. Maybe you're noticing a theme here. So just to recap very quickly, we have a coup plot against Castro that was hatched in 1963 after the Bay of Pigs, after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is with Juan Almejida, the commander of the Cuban army, who has said he will assist in taking out Castro and he will help take over the country if the U.S. will provide him with support. He cuts this deal with Bobby Kennedy himself through the intermediary of Harry Williams, who Lamar and I interviewed extensively on a couple of occasions, on multiple occasions, actually. The coup plot is ongoing. They were going to have a Soviet-associated patsy take the credit for the assassination of Castro in Cuba on December 1st, 1963. And then, I don't know, I'm sure I'm missing. Oh, and then we talked to Dean Rusk, and he confirmed that this was going on. He was Kennedy's Secretary of State. We talked to Harry Williams. He confirmed it. Lamar was talking about talking with John Nolan, who was Bobby Kennedy's closest aide, best friend, or one of his best friends, and he confirmed that there was actually essentially, or sort of confirmed that there was essentially a cover-up. Lamar, my recollection is that I found a document in the Kennedy Library after I met with Dave Powers, who was in the car behind Kennedy. He was Kennedy's right-hand man.
Right. That was the first page.
And it had Al Haig's name on it.
The Cuba contingency plan. So those are those plans. Bobby had the secret subcommittee of the National Security Council start making in September. Then I later on I got like 20 more pages from an Army.
Right, and so this plan was in place in case Castro got wind of this new attempt to assassinate him on December 1st, 1963. If he heard about it in advance and decided to take revenge on the United States by killing our ambassador to Panama, was the example John Nolan gave you, exactly, then we would cover that up by getting that ambassador's body to Washington, D.C. and essentially mutilating it in an autopsy if necessary and controlling all the information.
Exactly, because the goal would be, as Nolan explained, and the documents indicate, but Nolan just was bluntly explaining. He said, look, the point is you had to control the flow of information to keep the U.S. president from being forced into an invasion of Cuba.
Correct.
Until you
by
get
the American public.
All this.
Right, right. If the word got out that Castro had just killed the American ambassador to Panama, the pressure for another invasion of Cuba would be so great. And John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy were both concerned that, number one, that would get in the way of their December 1st, 63 effort to kill Castro, and number two, it could provoke World War III. Russia would intervene. So
we've gotten so close to that.
So they changed the entrance wound in the front of Kennedy's throat to an exit wound to make it look like he was shot from behind.
Well, they didn't actually. I mean, they were. From everything I have read since, coupled with what Nolan said, someone was literally, and they may have only had 15 or 20 minutes. People should know that the honor guard that was supposed to escort JFK's the hearse with JFK's body from Air Force One to Bethesda lost it. So there are 30, 45 minutes like totally unaccounted for. There are all these different times as to when the autopsy supposedly started. So it looks like so they weren't mutilating it just to hide. I mean, somebody had a very limited amount of time, and so I think they were literally so it was a little entrance wound, little tracheotomy incision. They wanted to see where that bullet went.
Yeah.
So that's what, so that was, so the fact that it was horribly mutilated and large was kind of a byproduct. And so the autopsy doctors and else, they didn't even know there was a wound in the front of the throat. They didn't find that out until Sunday. Right. So two more quick things about Nolan. They're very important. One is, if somebody watched the Oliver Stone movie, which is good as drama, but it was Jim Garrison's investigation that the movie is about. It was like 1967, 68. There's a little information that's more recent than that's credible, but otherwise, JFK is a well-done dramatic movie that's state-of-the-art as far as what we knew in '68, which, we knew a lot more by the '70s and the '80s and in the early '90s. You would think that a bunch of shadowy generals controlled the autopsy, but it wasn't. I mean, as Nolan, who was the intermediary, told me, it was Bobby Kennedy who controlled the autopsy through him and through Admiral Berkeley, and there are many other people I cite in the book, people who were there that confirmed that. And by the way, I don't take anybody's word for anything. I looked hard, and sure enough, there was a Kennedy-authorized book, initially authorized by Jackie, called Death of a President by William Manchester in the mid-'60s. If anyone looks in that book, you will see that at Bethesda with Bobby Kennedy was John Nolan.
Right.
Because otherwise, John Nolan is such a low-profile figure. So when people have wondered what happened to JFK's brain, what happened to all the missing autopsy evidence, tissue samples, what happened to the missing X-rays and photographs, based on what Nolan told me and other research I was able to do after that, all that wound up with Bobby Kennedy. I mean, that's what all the evidence shows. So, in other words, it wasn't shadowy general.
And it was because he was trying to protect the world from World War III.
Exactly. Bobby
he wasn't trying to cover up some crime that he thought he was part of. He was trying to prevent World War III. And Al Haig was in on this, and Cyrus Vance was in on this, and Dean Rusk was in.
Part of those. The contingency planning for what to do if American assassination. Guess who they turned to handle all the burial details? Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano, who had both been working on these, both the coup plan and the contingency plans to protect the coup.
And both have subsequently confirmed that. So they've never talked about Commander Almeida or anything, but they talked about they'd worked with the Cubans, the cover-up essentially,
and they had worked. And they had worked on, aspects of the coup plan. So they're both very careful people, or were. Califano's still alive. So one last thing about John Nolan, and then we'll get into your interview with somebody who's never been named ever by us anywhere, and that is Nolan said. So Nolan was a lawyer at the Justice Department, and Nolan said that Bobby Kennedy asked him to do a secret investigation of the assassination because Bobby Kennedy kept any information about the coup plan away from the Warren Commission. Okay, so even though Bobby trusted some of the people in the Warren Commission, he didn't trust others, and it was actually some of Bobby Kennedy's own people that kind of pressured to create the Warren Commission, because otherwise the only investigation would have been under the control of J. Edgar Hoover, and Bobby and his aides didn't like him at all. So how can an investigation be done? Well, so Bobby asked John Nolan, who knew all about the coup plan and who knew some about the mafia, because everything Bobby was doing about the mafia, those papers went across John Nolan's desk before they went to Bobby. And so John Nolan, he probably knew about as much about the mafia as anybody at Justice at that time, the mafia and their ally Hoffa. And unlike everyone else at the Justice Department, except for Bobby, John Nolan knew about the coup plan. And so Nolan did his own private investigation that was only shared with Robert Kennedy. And so you can imagine, one question I asked John Nolan was, well, what did you find? And Nolan said, did you see that Jack Anderson special back in 1988? And I said, yes, I did. That's what got me and my collaborator on this, Thom Hartmann, interested. He said, that had a very important piece of the puzzle that and again, he's being very careful in his wording, so I'm summarizing what he would take 5 minutes to say, okay? Just want to make that clear. And he said, he implied, I should say, that he had focused on Carlos Marcello, the godfather of Louisiana and Texas, who had been being prosecuted by Bobby's Justice Department in New Orleans pretty much the whole month of November. And Nolan had focused on Santo Trafficante. But Nolan said the person he wasn't not able to uncover in 1964 was Johnny Roselli. So it was only in the 70s when the Senate committee revealed Johnny Roselli, and in that Jack Anderson special, he said Roselli was the final piece. That's what you should look at, Roselli, Marcello, and
which
Trump.
Brought us to mafia.
Again, so right now we've got, we've had Rusk, Harry Williams, and then John Nolan.
Right.
And by the way, John Nolan basically said, again, you would take 5 minutes to say it, but he implied, he had kept up with everything. Here's something very important your listeners are going to find amazing, but it's good to talk about before the break. So when John Nolan was first working for Bobby Kennedy, one of his first jobs was helping Bobby Kennedy with getting the Bay of Pigs prisoners out of Cuba in the fall of '62. So that's also how John Nolan came to become such good friends, lifelong friends, with Harry Williams, because they remained lifelong friends.
Yeah, because it was Harry's reference that
that even got me to be able to talk. Because again, when I asked Nolan, was Harry Williams credible? Nolan, I think he said, and again, words to the effect. These aren't his words to the effect, and he took 5 minutes to say it. Imagine the most credible person you can imagine that you would literally trust your life to.
Yeah.
And you can trust every word they say. That's Harry Williams. So I was like, oh, okay. And then he, and then individually he confirmed more.
So was Nolan part of the, this group this document that I found that had Al Haig's name on it, at the Kennedy Library?
He wasn't part of that group, but he saw every document because there were
he was aware of it.
5 agents. Yeah. So he
this was essentially the cover-up group.
Right. Went through Nolan to that they would call it the Protect Us from World War III group.
Exactly.
So it depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
But get this about Nolan. So Nolan was working with a guy named I think it was William Donovan to get the Bay of Pigs prisoners out, who was like a distinguished former diplomatic kind of guy. Okay. And so then but even after the Bay of Pigs prisoners came back, there were still 21 Americans in Cuban prisons, including 4 CIA agents. Okay. And so they needed to come out. So Donovan and John Nolan were tasked with getting those prisoners out, without revealing the fact that 4 of the 21 people were CIA agents, because that's what you do. You don't say, oh, we want these 4 people out, because then Castro would say, oh, why do they want these 4 people? You say, oh, we want to get all the 21 Americans left, and then hopefully Castro won't realize, 4 of those are CIA agents, which under the, I guess, international rules could theoretically be shot. So they started skin diving together, Donovan and Nolan, who was much, much younger man than Nolan. And, of course, Castro was a very fit former baseball player. They started skin diving together off the coast of Cuba with Fidel Castro as a way to, be friendly with him, get to know him, negotiate. It was that kind of roundabout way of
Was this in 63?
This is in the spring of 1963.
Thank you.
So they go skin diving more than once with Fidel Castro. So get this. Now, the CIA is still working with the Mafia, and Roselli especially, but also Trafficante and Marcello, to try and kill Fidel Castro, right? The CIA finds out about this, and they find out that Nolan and Donovan want to give Castro a nice, expensive American diving suit. The CIA first tries to figure out how to put poison in that diving suit to kill Castro. When that won't work out, they look at planting a seashell with a powerful explosive that would kill Castro, Nolan, and Donovan while they're skin diving.
Right. Nolan told you that the CIA almost killed him. And Lamar, you were just finishing up just a moment ago. We were just talking about how John Nolan was telling you how the CIA essentially tried to kill him.
Exactly. When Nolan was trying to get the last 21 Americans out, this is after the Bay of Pigs prisoners, spring of '63, twice the CIA tried to contaminate with deadly poison a diving suit that Nolan and his partner in the negotiation with Castro, Donovan, were going to give to Castro. When they couldn't figure out the poison right, then they looked at putting an exploding seashell down there so that when Nolan was skin diving with Fidel, they'd both be blown up. So Nolan made a point to tell me that he was not happy when those details came out in the 1970s, and strongly implied that's why he was telling me some of the things he told me. But one thing he didn't tell me, so Harry Williams by this time had given us the name of Commander Almeida, but I wanted some confirmation of that. Nolan never used Almeida's name, and so I didn't press it.
Now, let me just pause for a second. Almeida was the head of the, for people who might have just tuned in, Almeida was the head of the Cuban army, and
the
was
founder of the Cuban Army.
The founder of the Cuban Army. He was black. He was the highest black official in Cuba. He had become very disenchanted with the revolution. He thought Castro was turning Cuba into a dictatorship, and he had reached out to Harry and to Bobby Kennedy and said, I will help take out Castro on December 1st, 1963, if you guys will backstop me.
Exactly. So I didn't press Nolan on Commander Almeida's name because he was giving me so much other great stuff. And by the way, at the end of the conversation, Nolan was very pleasant the whole time, but he made it real clear. Yeah, this would be our only conversation, and we would never meet. And I'm just grateful. Hey, you've been super helpful. So, but we always try to get confirmation for everything. So Harry had given us Commander Almeida's name. Dean Rusk had only indicated the position. John Nolan had indicated the position, but we needed another confirmation on Almeida's name, because that's how we manage the millions of facts about the JFK assassination, is only using stuff in our books that we can find independent corroboration for. We never take anybody's word for anything. So how would we get that confirmation? Well, Harry said one of the five fingers was the commander of the Cuban-American troops at Fort Benning, Georgia, who would be the first U.S. troops to go into Cuba, this multiracial brigade who was commanded by a black man named, I believe it's pronounced, Erneido Oliva.
Erneido Oliva, yeah.
And
he was a brigadier. When I met him, he was a brigadier general, was he not?
Right. So at that time, he was the brigadier general at the Washington National Guard, who was in charge of the Washington National Guard, which for a black man in 1992, most people didn't know there were black generals until Colin Powell. That was a major accomplishment. In addition to the fact, then General Oliva was Cuban American. And so basically Harry said, look, he knows all about the coup plan. You should talk to him. He was one of the leaders at the Bay of Pigs. He was the leader of the Cuban Americans, who would be the first U.S. troops, the multiracial brigade that would go into Cuba after the coup at the invitation of its new leader, Commander Juan Almeida. And so you arranged to talk to to General Oliva back in 1992.
Yeah. And I made an appointment with him, got on a plane, went to Washington, D.C. He was in my recollection is that he was in the building that was the National Guard building. It was one of these old 1950s buildings. And I waited a while outside his office, and finally, I was let in, and here's this guy in his general uniform, and in this big room, and on the far end of the room was, as I recall, a fairly loud window air conditioner and a couch. And so I sit down and start talking with him, and we're talking about Harry, and he's like, "Oh, I haven't seen Harry in a decade. We used to go fishing, and Harry's just a wonderful guy." And so it was just kind of this chatty thing.
And people should know. So you and I had developed these questions for General Oliva, okay?
Right.
And in the middle of the questions,
I asked him about Juan Almeida, the commander of the Cuban military, and everything went to hell. We're trying to, do you want to do the quick recap, Lamar?
Well, yeah. So basically, the first of the 24 people that worked with John and Robert Kennedy, who basically gave us the high-level view of what happened and why everything was kept so secret, because we were getting ready to stage a coup against Fidel Castro on December 1st, 1963, that would be led by the number 3 man in Cuba, the head of the Cuban army. And Castro's death would be blamed on a Russian or a Russian sympathizer. And those sources were, in the order we talked about them, and we interviewed them, were JFK Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Bobby Kennedy's close friend and the top Cuban exile aide in the secret operation, Harry Williams, and John Nolan, who was Bobby Kennedy's closest aide, who saw every top secret piece of paper that went to Bobby Kennedy, went through John Nolan. And then that brings us to the other man that confirmed that Commander Almeida was the guy who was going to lead the coup plan, and that was he was a general. When you talked to him, I think it was back in 1992, General Oliva, and we had written up these questions, and we were just kind of slip. You were going to slip Commander Almeida's name into the conversation, just in a matter-of-fact way. You weren't going to say, "So who was the guy?" No, you were just going to ask a question that almost assumed that did assume that General Oliva knew who Almeida was, and that Almeida was the top guy in Cuba working on the coup plan.
Right.
So now I will pitch it back to you, because as soon as you ask him that question, things happen.
All hell breaks loose. Well, also just to put that into the context, at that time that you and I were writing this book, we assumed that this plan died with John Kennedy, or in the months immediately thereafter.
And I think by that time, I was generally aware that Commander Almeida had not been seen in Cuba for at least, I think by that time, but by about 3 years or so.
Right.
So the assumption
we thought he was dead.
He was dead.
Right. So here I am assuming that Almeida is dead, and assuming that this plan, this top secret coup plan that it was supposed to be executed on December 1st, 1963 was a dead plan. And so I'm sitting in the office of this brigadier general in Washington, D.C., who was going to lead, had been at Fort Benning, with the Cuban troops that they were going to bring into Cuba after the death of Castro in
right, because he was a Cuban American. He'd been a leader at the Bay of Pigs. Right. He was black. He was going to lead that multiracial brigade in right after. And
he was such a sweet guy. I mean, we had this wonderful conversation, and then I said, so one of the things that Harry mentioned to me was that General Juan Almeida, the commander of the Cuban military, was in on the deal and was going to take over Cuba when John Kennedy was assassinated. And at that point, Oliva just goes. He jerks upright. He gets up. He walks around his desk. I'm sitting in a chair opposite his desk. Grabs me. My recollection is he grabbed my lapel, and essentially drags me over to the window where this air conditioner is running, and says, "Don't you ever say that name again. That is an active operation. That man is still around. This is top secret, and you could be executed for talking about this," or words to that effect. That's my recollection. So back to you, Lamar. At that point, and by the way, at that point, we had this oh crap moment and realized maybe we have to novelize this. I mean, this is why Almeida's name does not appear in the first two books, because neither one of us wanted to go to prison for the rest of our lives. Right.
So basically, thanks to Harry Williams and John Nolan and Almeida, we were part of the cover-up. Again, the JFK movie, which is good dramatically, but it was really not state-of-the-art as far as what was known about the JFK assassination at the time. Certainly not today. I think there's a line, words to the effect. I'm not quoting it exactly, but if you figure out, so in the JFK movie, I think Kevin Costner, as Jim Garrison says, words to the effect. If you figure out who was behind the cover-up, you'll know who did the crime. Well, that's not true, because, Bobby Kennedy covered up a lot. You and I covered up a lot because we didn't want to get shot. B, Commander Almeida made another appearance in public about a year or so after you interviewed General Oliva. So
and Oliva had told us that it was still a live operation, so we're thinking, okay, Almeida may be, killing Castro any day now, and it was just insane. So, Lamar, we only have a few minutes left here. We've got probably a total of 15 minutes left.
One more thing about Commander Almeida. Though actually, I'll save that for the break time. So what was the plan to kill JFK? And so we now know preventing World War III was a big cause of a lot of the cover-ups. But, the other cause of the cover-ups, every one of the big agencies had a lot to hide. Because the mafia had found out about the coup plan, even though they were barred from the coup plan or from reopening their casinos, and they had infiltrated it through people like Johnny Roselli, through people like Jack Ruby. Believe it or not, there's actually, in the Warren volumes, not in the report, but in the volumes, there's an indication that Jack Ruby knew about the coup plan. We know that the guy that Joe Pesci played in the Oliver Stone movie, which again I like dramatically, Joe Pesci gave a great performance of a guy by the name of David Ferrie, who was a CIA agent. That was later confirmed by the executive assistant to one of the CIA directors. And so David Ferrie was also working for the mafia. So again, you just see that constantly, that almost all the mafia people involved were also working for the CIA. So the CIA was continuing their plan, developed under Vice President Nixon in 1960, to kill Fidel, and they continued it even after the coup plan was well along its way, I think, if for no other reason than as kind of a backup. I mean, what if Bobby is all set for a coup and Commander Almeida is killed in a car wreck? Well,
right. And John and Bobby thought if this had been shut down, they thought the mafia was out of this deal.
They thought that was all shut down in the spring of '62. It was still going. So
the mob now knows that there's this plan to kill Castro, and that there's also a plan to cover up any consequences that may come out of it, like Castro seeking revenge and killing the U.S. ambassador to Panama.
Well, right. And anybody just reading the newspapers at the time, remember, this is still a year after we all thought we were going to get blown up at the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
So the mob knew that the more they could connect their assassination plot to the coup plan, the more high government officials would be forced to cover up. Even the bullets in Oswald's rifle, the Dallas gunsmith who probably sold those, is in an FBI document talking about all the money that can be made in the stock market when this upcoming coup in Cuba happens. So you can tell why he wasn't taken to Washington to testify in front of the Warren Commission. So basically the mafia adapted the plan that was going to be used to kill Fidel, which we don't know in detail, but I cite a lot of evidence, especially in JFK, the hidden history of the JFK assassination. And in the even much bigger, much more detailed book, the first book, Ultimate Sacrifice. And by the way, people always want to get the trade paperbacks of our books, these, the JFK books and the Watergate book, because they have additional information that is not in the hardbacks. But I make a good case that Castro was probably, so Castro, he didn't like limousines. That wasn't the revolutionary style. He would travel between cities and to his estate in Veradero Beach in an open Jeep. It's to show he's a man of the people, right? By the way, his estate in Veradero Beach used to belong to Bobby Kennedy's wife's family.
Wow.
So the best place to kill Fidel would be when he's in that open Jeep. You could have professional sharpshooters kill him. You could set up somebody else to take the fall. It needed to be in public, just like the JFK assassination needed to be in public, so that, Raul, if he didn't die, couldn't hide the fact that Castro had been killed. So that's also why JFK had to be killed in public, so Bobby Kennedy couldn't hide the fact that JFK had been shot or was a vegetable, and while Bobby secretly ran the government.
Right. Plus, public killings were the way the mafia did business.
Let's talk about the government secrecy, and we'll save Chicago and Tampa. We'll jump right into that as soon as we come back. Let's talk about everything that was so much was withheld from the Warren Commission. It's not even funny. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was holding stuff. Everybody was holding stuff from the Warren Commission. Then we come to Watergate in 1972. Next year will be the 50th anniversary. Involved in Watergate were every one of the Watergate burglars, by the way, was a current or former CIA agent, not just asset, but actual agent. And every one of the Watergate burglars, plus their master controlling them from across the street, E. Howard Hunt, had worked on different aspects of the CIA mafia plots.
To kill Castro.
To kill Fidel Castro, that's right. Even James McCord, who was one of the two people the CIA assigned to work with Harry Williams. And by the way, Harry only had nice things to say about James McCord, who was kind of a Boy Scout. Harry only had bad things to say about E. Howard Hunt.
I remember.
And Bernard Barker. And Harry, was the guy who said, Bernard Barker, follow that name. He was involved, I'm sure of it, speaking of JFK's assassination. And sure enough, it turned out at the time of the Watergate break-in, where Barker was one of the Watergate burglars, Barker and his fellow Watergate burglar, Frank Sturgis, were working for Santo Trafficante at that time during the
Santo Trafficante, the guy, one of the three guys who had ordered the hit on John Kennedy.
Exactly right. So that kept a lot of information from the Senate Watergate Committee. When they started looking into that and interviewed Johnny Roselli about CIA Mafia plots, that got shut down, not by Republicans, but by Democratic Senator Sam Ervin, because I think someone had said, look, this can lead into some stuff we don't want to have out there, because Commander Almeida, still alive, still never. Exactly,
the same thing that Oliva told me. And by the way, after Johnny Roselli gave that little bit of testimony, didn't they find his body in a 55-gallon drum in the harbor was it off Miami, or was it?
Right. It was off Miami. So a lot of the stuff was kept from the Rockefeller Commission that Gerald Ford appointed. It was basically a whitewash, but they did turn up some good information. Then the Senate Church Committee with investigation. They brought back Johnny Roselli to testify not once, not twice, but I think at least 3 times, and maybe they were looking at a 4th. And then Johnny Roselli has lunch with Santo Trafficante down in Miami, and then he disappears, and then you're exactly right. He had been killed, dismembered, stuffed in a 55-gallon oil drum, but I hate to say this, but his decaying body expanded so much that instead of sinking, it came back to the surface from all the decomposition gases, and it washed ashore in part of Miami, and that was the first time any congressional Senate witness had ever been murdered. Roselli's boss, Sam Giancana, had been killed the year before. Jimmy Hoffa, who was an associate of Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, of course, he was killed, and so that's why the Senate Church Committee didn't get the full story, even though Senator Richard Schweikert and Gary Hart, a name some of your listeners will know, really focused on the JFK assassination, and then the second with the House Select Committee in the late 70s. Johnny Roselli's death was an open investigation, so that was an excuse for FBI, CIA, etc. to withhold Roselli from the House Select Committee.
How did the Mafia kill Kennedy?
Basically, they adapted the plan that was probably going to be used to kill Fidel by Commander Almeida. And the Mafia, even though they were barred from that coup plan or reopening their casinos, and so since it was Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood, the closest mobster to the CIA, the first attempt was going to be done in Chicago. The mob's plans don't always have just have a backup plan. Even their backup plans have backup plans. The backup plan for Chicago was Tampa, Florida, 4 days before Dallas. And so the third choice would be Dallas. And so we know from Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden, the first black presidential Secret Service agent, personally selected by JFK to be the first black presidential Secret Service agent, and other evidence that there was an attempt planned to kill JFK in Chicago. The Secret Service there lost surveillance on the potential assassins. They did arrest Patsy, who an ex-Marine with a lot of interesting similarities to Oswald, who worked in a warehouse overlooking the Chicago parade route. JFK was so concerned that they canceled not just the motorcade, but the entire trip at the last minute, a visit to a big football game with powerful Chicago Mayor Daley, probably the most powerful Democrat in the country on that level, and they had JFK's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, who I interviewed, give 2 phony excuses in the space of 30 minutes, because they didn't want to say, oh, well, JFK didn't go because he was afraid we were going to get, he was going to get shot. So that didn't work. They next looked at Tampa, Florida, where JFK was going to have the longest motorcade of his presidential career. Again, the local police and Secret Service and FBI found out that there were actually 2 plots to kill JFK. They didn't know it was one plot. They knew there was a white supremacist on Miami police surveillance tape talking about JFK being shot with a high-powered rifle from a tall building. And then there was another plot, and actually these are all part of the same plot, that was related to the Mafia. So JFK was going to give a speech that night with words the CIA had helped him write, directed to reassure Commander Almeida that JFK was 100% behind him and he should go ahead with the coup.
2 weeks later.
So JFK could not cancel his Tampa motorcade. So I interviewed the Tampa chief of police. The Tampa chief of police said, look, we got too many tall buildings. We can't guard all of them. There's the biggest hotel in Tampa, this big tall building that between you and I looks like the school book depository, only bigger and all the windows open. you shouldn't do this. JFK couldn't explain to him why he had to do it, and he did it. And then it was nerve-wracking. Jackie was not with him. JFK went to Miami that night, gave the speech with the lines in the middle of it.
Tampa.
Well, he finished his Tampa motorcade, then he flew to Miami.
Then he went to Miami,
He beat in Miami to a press group, and the next day, some of the papers, like Dallas Times-Herald, JFK virtually calls for Cuban coup. But Commander Almeida got the message, says, that's good enough for me, let's go with it. And so in Dallas, see, people let their guard down. That's why most of the Secret Service agents on JFK's presidential detail went out drinking until between 2 and 5
because they thought they just dodged a bullet in Tampa.
Exactly. There'd been tenseness with Chicago. Tampa was horrible. Now they can relax. Well, of course, they couldn't relax. We know what happened. As far as, by the way, there was a patsy in Tampa who had 26 similarities to Oswald that I detail. I summarize in The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. I give you every detail in Ultimate Sacrifice.
Right.
And so, if something had happened to Oswald that morning, the Tampa patsy went to Dallas after Tampa was called off. By the way, the head of the Tampa Police Intelligence Unit, what used to be called the Red Squad, but was then called the Police Intelligence Unit, was working for Senator Trafficante. That's how Trafficante found out the police knew, Secret Service knew. That's why they called that off. But again, see, everybody could finally relax. And so JFK, and this is in the book, is talking about how easy it would have been, for someone to shoot him from a high building, or when he was at the airport flying into Fort Worth, it would have been easy for someone, because of what had happened in Chicago and Tampa. So then, this all happens. Oswald, by the way, the Navy, Naval Intelligence, Marine Intelligence, they did their own investigation of Oswald. They concluded he was incapable of doing the actual shooting or masterminding the assassination. I talked to somebody who helped with that investigation, who monitored Oswald before the assassination, and basically, Oswald didn't do it. Professionals did it. I mean, and basically Nolan had said, after Nolan basically told me it was Marcello Trafficante, I said, so you mean it was like a mob hit, with professionals? He was like, oh, yeah. I mean, Nolan was so dismissive of it's like the fact that Oswald could have done this, it's just like, that was just not even worthy of, consideration. So bottom line is, the files were supposed to be released back in the late 1990s. The CIA and all the other agencies stalled, and then they were still supposed to be released after that. They weren't. They were supposed to be released in 2017. They weren't. Trump kicked it to 2018. Joe Biden has now kicked it until December 15th of this year, but he's given the agencies an out. If you ever want to see those documents, though, call the White House, call your member of Congress, call your senator.
Lamar Waldron.
Never get to see those documents.
The 3 books. Lamar and I together wrote Ultimate Sacrifice and Secrecy, although Lamar did the heavy lifting. And Lamar has since written Watergate, The Hidden History. It's a brilliant trilogy. Lamar, thanks so much.
And The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. I'm reading the wrong line. Thank you, Lamar. And thank you all for watching us. Get out there, get active. Tag, you're it.